Just 1 minute after federal agents stepped through the front door of Nancy Guthrie's quiet home, the entire tone of the investigation changed. What began as a routine search quickly turned into something far more unsettling. According to people close to the scene, what investigators uncovered was not just unexpected, it raised questions no one had been asking before. And the deeper officials looked inside that house, the harder it became to understand how so much stayed hidden for so long. Just 1 minute after federal agents stepped through the front door of Nancy Guthrie's quiet home, the entire tone of the investigation changed. What began as a routine search quickly turned into something far more unsettling. According to people close to the scene, what investigators uncovered was not just unexpected, it raised questions no one had been asking before. And the deeper officials looked inside that house, the harder it became to understand how so much stayed hidden for so long. 4 years, Nancy Guthrie had lived the kind of life most people would never look at twice. She was known as quiet, reserved, the kind of person neighbors described with the same simple words over and over again. She kept to herself. She was polite. Nothing ever seemed unusual. From the outside, her home looked no different from any other house on that street. The lawn was trimmed. The windows were clean. The routine never changed. Morning lights came on at the same time. Deliveries arrived occasionally. And by evening, everything returned to silence. That was why the sight of federal vehicles pulling into that calm neighborhood felt so deeply out of place. People standing near their windows later said the street changed in seconds. Doors cracked open. Curtains moved. Phones were lifted quietly into the air. No one knew exactly why the FBI was there, but everyone understood one thing immediately. Something serious had happened. Agents moved with purpose. There was no confusion. No hesitation. They walked directly toward the house as if they already knew what they were looking for. And in neighborhoods like that, people notice details. They notice the way professionals carry themselves when they expect to find nothing. And they notice when those same professionals suddenly look like they found something they did not expect. That morning, several witnesses said the atmosphere shifted almost immediately after agents entered the home. The calm procedure visible from outside began to change. More personnel were called in. Equipment was brought to the front door. The search that many assumed would be brief became something much larger. And that was the moment people began asking the same question. What could possibly be inside that house? Cases like this rarely begin the day authorities arrive. Long before anyone saw those vehicles outside, investigators had reportedly been watching quietly in the background. Information had been gathered. Timelines had been reviewed. Small details that once seemed unrelated may have started forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. That part of the story often remains invisible. Because by the time federal agents appear in public, the private investigation has usually been unfolding for much longer than anyone realizes. Some reports suggested the search warrant itself had been tied to evidence collected over several months. Others hinted that concerns about Nancy had surfaced long before that morning but had never reached public attention. And that detail made the story even more unsettling. Because it suggested the search was not sudden. It was the result of something building quietly behind the scenes. And if that was true, then the real story may have started long before the neighborhood ever noticed. One former resident of the area later described the moment as surreal. He said nothing in that neighborhood had ever felt dangerous. Nothing had ever felt suspicious. The kind of place where people believed they understood the lives happening around them. But moments like this can shatter that belief instantly. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories do not begin in places that look broken. They begin in places that look completely normal. As the hours passed, the scene outside Nancy's home only grew stranger. Agents remained inside far longer than expected. More unmarked vehicles arrived. Boxes were carried out carefully. Evidence bags could be seen from a distance, though no one could tell what was inside them. That only made the silence louder. Officials gave no immediate statement. No explanation. No reassurance. And in the absence of answers, speculation spread faster than facts. Some believed it was financial. Others thought it might involve someone else connected to her. A few wondered whether Nancy herself had been living with a secret no one around her had ever suspected. But that was only the beginning. because what happened inside the house during those first moments would soon make the entire case far more disturbing than anyone expected. Before going further, what do you think people truly know about the neighbors living around them? And can anyone ever really tell what is happening behind someone else's front door? Let me know what you think below. At first, investigators appeared to move through the home the way they always do, slowly, methodically, room by room. Every drawer documented. Every cabinet checked. Every detail photographed. It was careful work. Professional. Controlled. But things did not stay that way. At first, investigators appeared to move through the home the way they always do, slowly, methodically, room by room. Every drawer documented. Every cabinet checked. Every detail photographed. It was careful work. Professional. Controlled. But things did not stay that way. From the outside, the home had looked ordinary. Inside, it seemed much the same. Family photographs sat neatly on shelves. Books were arranged with unusual precision. Furniture was placed carefully, almost as if the house had been prepared to leave a certain impression on anyone who entered. Nothing seemed broken. Nothing appeared chaotic. That was what made the shift even more disturbing. Because in many investigations, the most unsettling discoveries are often hidden inside places that appear the most normal. Agents reportedly moved through the main rooms without much reaction at first. The kitchen looked untouched. The living room was clean. Hallways showed no obvious signs of anything unusual. If someone had walked in without context, they might have assumed the search would end with nothing more than paperwork and unanswered questions. Then one part of the house drew attention. According to people familiar with the early investigation, there was a section of the property that did not seem to fit the rest of the home. It was not immediately obvious, but investigators noticed that one interior door appeared different from the others. It was heavier, more reinforced, and unlike the rest of the house, it remained locked. That small detail changed everything. At first, it may have seemed minor. Some people keep private rooms, storage spaces, old offices. But trained investigators often notice what others dismiss. They notice scratches around locks, new hardware in old homes, signs that something has been opened and closed far more often than it should be. And this door reportedly raised exactly those kinds of questions. Witnesses later said the pace inside the home changed almost immediately after agents focused on that area. Communication became more urgent. More personnel were directed toward that part of the property. What had started as a routine search now appeared to become something far more serious. And neighbors watching from outside could sense it without hearing a word. Because body language can reveal what silence tries to hide. When agents eventually gained access to the room, officials have never fully explained what they saw in that first moment. Public records remained limited. Statements stayed cautious. But multiple reports suggested that whatever was inside was enough to shift the direction of the investigation completely. The search was no longer just about confirming a suspicion. It was about understanding how long something had been hidden. That detail became one of the most unsettling parts of the case. Because investigators were no longer asking whether something unusual had happened inside that home. They were asking how it had remained unnoticed for so long. And in cases like this, that can be even more disturbing than the discovery itself. Sources close to the investigation claimed that several items recovered from that locked area did not match the life Nancy Guthrie appeared to live publicly. Some were described as deeply personal. Others reportedly raised concerns that extended beyond the property itself. While officials avoided releasing specifics, the silence around those items only intensified public speculation. People began asking whether Nancy had been hiding more than possessions. They began wondering whether she had been hiding an entirely different life. That possibility changed the way many people saw the story. Until that point, Nancy had still been viewed by some as a private woman caught in a confusing investigation. But once reports of the locked room began circulating, public opinion started to shift. Because secrets behind locked doors rarely stay private for long. Former neighbors began speaking more openly. Some recalled strange noises at unusual hours. Others remembered visitors who never stayed long. A few admitted there had been moments that felt odd in hindsight but never serious enough to report. That is often how these stories unfold. Not with one obvious warning, but with dozens of small moments that only make sense after everything falls apart. And investigators now appeared to be piecing together those moments one by one. The room itself reportedly became a central focus because it suggested planning, intent, deliberate separation from the rest of the home. It was not just hidden. It seemed protected. That distinction mattered, because it suggested the space was never meant to be discovered casually. Someone wanted it to stay unseen. And that single detail may have told investigators more than anything else in the house. As evidence continued leaving the property, public curiosity only grew stronger. News began spreading beyond the neighborhood. Online discussions exploded. People who had never heard Nancy Guthrie's name before suddenly wanted to know everything about her. But the deeper people looked into her past, the more uncomfortable the story became. Because what investigators found behind that locked door may not have been the beginning of the case at all. It may have been proof that the Rayall story had started much earlier. Once investigators began reviewing everything removed from the home, the case reportedly started to look very different. What first appeared to be a single disturbing discovery slowly became something more complex. Piece by piece, details that once seemed unrelated began forming a pattern that was much harder to ignore. And that was when the investigation moved beyond the walls of the house itself. Officials were no longer just asking what had been hidden inside the property. They were now trying to understand whether the signs had been there all along, scattered through years of small moments that no one had fully understood at the time. That possibility made the story even darker. Because sometimes the most shocking discoveries are not the ones buried in secret rooms. Sometimes they are the ones people unknowingly witnessed in plain sight. As investigators reportedly examined documents, digital records, and personal belongings taken from the home, certain timelines began to overlap in ways that raised new questions. Events from years earlier suddenly seemed less random. Routine interactions appeared less innocent. Even simple details from Nancy's daily life started to feel different when placed beside what agents had already found. And with every connection, the image of an ordinary life began to crack. People who once described Nancy as quiet began remembering things they had pushed aside. A missed conversation. A strange comment. An uncomfortable moment that felt too small to matter at the time. Alone, none of it seemed important. But together, those memories started to paint a very different picture. One former acquaintance reportedly said the hardest part was realizing that nothing felt obvious until after the search. That is what often unsettles people most. Not the secret itself, but the feeling that they may have stood close to it without ever seeing it. Some neighbors began recalling visitors who arrived late and left quickly. Others remembered long periods when the home seemed empty, followed by sudden bursts of activity that never made sense. A few even described moments when Nancy appeared anxious, as though she feared something was slowly catching up with her. At the time, those moments meant nothing. Now they seemed impossible to forget. Investigators are often trained to recognize patterns ordinary people miss. A single event may not matter, but when repeated over time, even small details can reveal something much larger. And according to sources familiar with the case, that may be exactly what happened here. The search of the house had uncovered more than evidence. It had uncovered context. And context can change everything. Because a strange object can be explained away. A locked room can be denied. But a pattern is much harder to dismiss. As federal agents reportedly worked backward through months, and possibly years, of records, they may have discovered that what happened inside Nancy's home was not isolated. Instead, it may have been connected to earlier concerns that never reached the public. Concerns that, on their own, seemed too small to trigger alarm. Until now. That realization shifted attention away from just Nancy and toward the people around her. Some began asking whether others had noticed more than they admitted. Others wondered if warning signs had been overlooked simply because no one wanted to believe something darker could exist so close to home. And that question stayed with the public. How much can people ignore when a person seems normal enough? That question became more unsettling as online interest in the case exploded. Strangers began digging into old photos, archived posts, and public records, trying to understand who Nancy Guthrie really was before the search. The more people looked, the more they found little inconsistencies that had once gone unnoticed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make people uncomfortable. That kind of discovery often changes how a story feels. At first, people focus on the shocking event. But later, they become haunted by the moments that came before it, the quiet warnings that no one understood until it was too late. And this case seemed to be moving in exactly that direction. By then, the story was no longer just about what agents found in one room of one house. It was becoming a story about hidden behavior, missed signs, and the unsettling possibility that some secrets survive because they hide inside ordinary lives. That idea struck people deeply because it felt familiar. Most people want to believe dangerous truths look obvious. But many do not. Many hide behind routines, polite smiles, closed curtains, and carefully built silence. Some of the people closest to Nancy reportedly struggled with that reality the most. They were not just processing what investigators may have uncovered. They were confronting the possibility that they had known someone for years without ever knowing her at all. And for some, that can feel worse than the discovery itself. Because evidence can explain what happened. But it cannot always explain why no one saw it sooner. As the investigation continued, one thing became increasingly clear. The search inside the house had not answered the biggest questions. It had only revealed where those questions needed to begin. And what happened next would push the story far beyond one neighborhood and into public scrutiny Nancy could no longer avoid. Right at the moment the story was beginning to feel bigger than one house, many people following it started asking for updates every time new information surfaced. And if stories like this matter to you, staying close to the details often reveals the parts most headlines miss. Because the public story was about to become far more complicated. Because the public story was about to become far more complicated. Once news of the search began spreading beyond the neighborhood, the case changed in a way many investigations do. It stopped being private. It stopped being local. And it became something the public felt they needed to understand. At first, only fragments of information were available. A few reports confirmed federal agents had entered the property. Others mentioned evidence being removed. But because officials released so little, people started filling the silence themselves. And silence can sometimes create more suspicion than facts ever could. Within hours, Nancy Guthrie's name began appearing across social media. People who had never heard of her before were suddenly searching old records, sharing photos, and trying to understand how someone described as ordinary could become the center of such a disturbing investigation. That was when the image Nancy had lived behind for years began to fall apart. For a long time, she had seemed almost invisible. She was not someone who lived publicly. She did not appear to seek attention. To many people, she was simply another person living a quiet life behind closed doors. But once public attention turned toward her, that quiet life started looking very different. Old interviews were revisited. Past interactions were examined. Even harmless moments from years earlier began taking on a different meaning under the weight of what investigators may have found inside the home. Things that once felt forgettable suddenly felt loaded with questions. And people began asking whether the signs had always been there. Some former acquaintances defended her immediately. They said the version of Nancy being described online did not match the woman they thought they knew. They spoke about kindness, routine, familiarity. They described someone who seemed too ordinary to be connected to something so deeply unsettling. But others were less certain. Some admitted that small moments had never fully made sense, strange comments, uneasy silences, details that felt wrong but never serious enough to question. That made the case more compelling. The public was no longer watching just an investigation. They were watching two very different versions of one person collide. As coverage grew, each update created more questions. Why now? How long had investigators known? And was Nancy acting alone? That changed everything. The story was no longer about one woman or one house. It became about whether something larger had been hidden in plain sight. Because what unsettled people most was not only what investigators found. It was what still had not been explained. The silence that followed became its own mystery. Brief statements, sealed records, and missing answers only deepened suspicion. For some, that meant caution. For others, It suggested the truth could be worse than anyone imagined. Soon, Nancy was no longer just the subject of an investigation. She became a symbol of something deeply unsettling, the idea that someone can appear completely ordinary while hiding a life no one ever truly saw. And that is why the story stayed with people. Not because of what was discovered, but because of what may still remain hidden.